You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your very wealthy CEO host, Abraham.
And I'm your wishing I could join a union host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do and animals do and the work that people do and how they try and use different systems to best support their work, I guess.
And so in our series of random episodes that we talk about work in general, this is one that we're going to kind of dive into some of the policy and procedure around how working might work.
You could maybe loosely sort of categorize this inside of our organizational OBM type discussions a little.
Sure.
But it's fairly tangential, I think, only insofar as it refers to the kinds of policies that loosely might exist in an organization. And I think further does speak a little bit to the kinds of motivations and incentives that exist in a workspace. But I guess mostly this is a political episode, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's probably more accurate for sure.
Yeah. All right, very good. Well, anyway, if you're joining us for the first time and you'd like to support what we do, you can head over to our website. You can pick up some merch. You can join us on Patreon. You can like and subscribe, leave a rating and review. You can start a union and call it the Why We Do What We Do Union.
The Why We Do What We Crew.
Yeah, and we can salute you from a distance because I don't know what your work is, but I'll talk more about the ways that you can support us at the end of this discussion first before we dive into our topic today. However, we also like to acknowledge that you are listening to this probably on February 7th. And so welcome. Thank you for being here. Also, happy Black History Month, everybody.
Yes. So typically what we try to do is we try to do something to celebrate the Black community as much as we can. You know, we have a little radio show here where we do that. And so hopefully we can do that. And today we're going to share a link in our episode notes that will give you just some recommendations around a whole lot of books from Black authors. So it'll give you opportunity to kind of explore and pick and choose and read some really great books from some really wonderful people. So
yeah, we're so woke as a podcast because we mentioned that Black people have written books.
Yeah. I mean, I can't wait for Jordan Peterson to jump back into our reviews and start sharing some nonsense.
Yeah, like what about all those white authors? At which point I'll wave to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and say they're over there.
Right.
Not to say that they don't sell books by Black authors, but you know, the people who have had that opportunity tends to be. Anyway, let's talk about, it's also ballet day. So put on those ballet dancing shoes, pirouette the day away.
Whew. Yeah, that's probably an episode in itself at one point, because I feel like there's a lot of pain and struggle that goes into ballet and how much it hurts.
That's a good point.
People's feet.
I agree.
It must hurt.
Yeah.
It's also Harry Potter book night, which, you know, take that for what it is. I like the stories.
Yeah. I agree. Our world is complicated. It grows increasingly so over time.
Yes.
It's International Clash Day.
Yes, it is. Don't know what that is. It's also National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. I just learned today that apparently a program that George W. Bush put in place during his presidency has saved an estimated 25 million lives in Africa.
Wow.
Which I thought was really pretty powerful.
Yeah, every once in a while they'll do something right, you know?
Yeah.
Presidents, I mean, or people named George, maybe.
Yeah, broken clocks right twice a day, I guess.
Exactly. It's also National Fettuccine Alfredo Day.
Ooh, I like that. It's National Girls and Women in Sports Day.
National Periodic Table Day.
I do enjoy the elements.
Yes.
It's National Signing Day as well.
If you're a fan of getting poked by plants, it is Rose Day.
Or it could be a fan of Titanic.
Yeah, that's what it probably is.
It's also Send a Card to a Friend Day, which is really nice.
Oh, that's cute. Wave all your fingers at your neighbor day. Not just the one, not just the one in the middle, but all of them.
Yeah, all of them. I mean, save the special ones for the ones who deserve it, I guess.
You can do it creepy tentacle style, though, if you want.
That's what I would do.
Yeah, I'm watching you.
Yeah, I would put both of my hands up at the same time and go, ooh, like jazz hands to my neighbors.
Exactly.
It's World Read Aloud Day, which I always really liked.
Sure.
I'm one of those people that liked reading out loud. People don't like that, though.
Yeah, I like it. It's a different skill, but it related. I mean, got to be able to read out loud.
Yes.
African Heritage and Health Week, which I think is very fitting given the month.
Yes. It's also Burn Awareness Week. So be careful. Don't burn yourself.
Don't burn yourself. Children's Authors and Illustrations Week. You can overlap that with some of the Black authors of children's books.
I like that. And it's finally Dump Your Significant Jerk Week. So apparently this is a really good week for breakups too.
Yeah, it could just be a friend. I mean, if it's your significant jerk implies to me it could also just be a friend, but it could also be a significant other who's being a jerk.
That's true.
It's like, lose that zero and get yourself a dating app.
Well, or a hero. We can avoid the dating apps. We know those are a mess sometimes.
That's fair. That'd probably be something worth unpacking. Anyway, we're not a podcast about days to celebrate things. Instead, we are a podcast about the psychology of what people do. And one of the things that people do is they go out and they become politicians. And then they make laws. And they make laws that say what kinds of things people can and can't do. And sometimes they'll make laws that say what they can and can't do as part of their employment.
Yes.
And so, as I said, politics is human behavior. Therefore, politic things are under our umbrella. Not that it would have stopped us if it wasn't, but here we are.
Yes. So today we are going to talk about the idea of right to work laws and right to work states and what that does to humans and human behavior and different systems that we operate in. We are going to kind of talk about some of the policies for and against right to work laws and what that looks like. And just as kind of a fair heads up, we have our own opinions about things.
Right.
What we're going to do is we're going to try to do our best to be fair and try to do our best to make sure that we are sharing both sides of the argument. We kind of had this conversation before the show started. Our general views are typically pro-union. So that is going to come out a little bit. The discussion around unions is going to be an entirely different episode at some point in time, because that's in itself worth unpacking. But I just want to kind of give everybody that fair heads up before we dive into this one.
So yeah, as you said, we're talking about right to work laws. And the implication is that has to do with unions. And you're right. We do have to disclose up front that our bias is going to be that generally we see unions as a positive thing. And it is worth saying, up front that we understand there are caveats with certain unions and the bad things that have happened as a part of unions. But I think where we come down on this is generally unions are a thing that protects people. We are in favor of protecting people. Therefore, we're in support of unions. And I just keeping it as general as possible for that part of the discussion allows us to, I think, be really transparent about the biases that we have coming into this discussion. But also, as I said, we have the platform and I think the enough of a level of expertise. We're not lawyers, but we do psychology things.
Right. That
I think we can come in and we can have a nuanced discussion about this without necessarily landing on a firm conclusion and just sort of say, let's really carefully weigh out the pros and cons and let's talk about what's happening in these systems.
Absolutely. So it's also worth mentioning that this is a U.S.-centric topic.
Yeah.
A lot of the laws and the policies and things that we're going to talk about are specific to the U.S. So we are going to talk about this idea of right to work. So we are going to talk about what it is, what it isn't, where it came from, and where it's possibly going.
Yes. Ready to just dive right into this?
Let's do it.
All right. We've already given, I think, a pretty good kickoff. So I think we're already rolling a bit. But to make sure we're really clear on giving the background on what right to work laws are. Now, it's despite what the name sounds like, these are not laws that insist that every person has the right to work. That is actually not what they're saying. That's not part of the thesis here.
Right.
They are not laws that guarantee your right to work. There are other laws that do that, but the ones that are called right to work laws, they are actually not saying everybody has an equal right to work. That's not what they do.
Right.
They are also not laws that protect your employment of any kind. Kind of. We'll get to that. But they are, in a sense, not laws that protect your employment. We'll unpack the sort of pros and cons of these laws, and that you can maybe make the case that they do protect employment in a way, but just in principle, that's not what they do as the function of that law.
Right. So right to work laws, RTW laws, are laws that are state laws specifically that intend to protect the, quote, right of every American to work for a living without being compelled to belong to a union, end quote. And that comes from the National Right to Work Legal Defense Fund. So another clear definition says that, or it states that, quote, A right-to-work state is one that has passed state legislation stipulating that no individual can be forced, as a condition of employment, to join or pay dues to a labor union, end quote. So, just to be clear, right-to-work laws say that somebody has the right to go to work without being forced into a union.
Yes. Okay. So that is a very important piece of the definition, understanding that these are state laws and that the state laws are intended to and state that people cannot be compelled to join a union as a condition of their employment at a place they're going to work. Okay. So I think we need to unpack the history of this a little bit. Just like our Pledge of Allegiance, the term right to work has been attributed to a French socialist, in this case, Louis Blanc, in the mid 1800s. However, at that time, it was in reference to the idea that people be guaranteed protection to maintain employment. So although the way that it becomes used later, at the time that it was originated, it sort of was more like what it sounds like. It was a guarantee that people should have equal access to employment. And so that was the sort of 1800s.
Right. So the more contemporary use of the term, however, has been attributed to a conservative lobbyist named Vance Muse, which is a hell of a name.
Right.
Like there's sometimes you hear a name and you're like, wow, that is a name. It's like Max Power, the name that you want to touch, but you mustn't touch.
Yes.
So I don't know if you probably don't watch enough Simpsons to know that Homer changed his name to Max Power at some point in time.
I did not know
and he
that.
had a theme song.
Oh no.
That was the lyric.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was Max Power, the name that you want to touch, but you mustn't touch. That's how he sang that.
That's great.
So anyway, Vance Muse is the conservative lobbyist who's kind of linked to the term right to work as we know it today.
Yes. He was also nicknamed the Big Fink by labor unions. He really dressed the part of the Texan and was very outspoken. As a fun background on him, he liked to agitate people. He was a pot stirrer, if you will. He was directly quoted as saying, quote, "I am a Southerner and I am for white supremacy," end quote.
Ooh.
If that tells you a lot about him very quickly, then worth having the background on him, because he's really not the point of this discussion. But I think as part of understanding the development of these laws, knowing the kinds of people who were pushing for them the hardest is useful.
You should know who's on what team, I think.
Yeah. And what team they're on before they join your team.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or try to. Anyway, we've got some setup there. There are multiple starting points to the right to work laws. So it wasn't just him. There was multiple things coming together. Like most things, it's not just like, here's a thing, here's a cause, here's an effect. It's like, here's a whole bunch of conditions that came together to sort of produce the circumstance that would result in thing, in this case, right to work laws.
Right.
Most point to a 1935 act called the National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA. And this act did several things. It was a lot of these bills, if you read them, they're massive. But chief among the things that it did do for the purpose of this discussion, it specified that employees have certain inalienable, that's the word I'm looking for, inalienable rights, and that those rights included the ability to join or form a union where none exists or dismantle one that is no longer favored by the employees.
Okay. It's also designed to assist in union activities and that people can participate in a union even if it is unrecognized by the employer. So I think that's an important piece too.
It also specified that employees have the right to be represented by a union, and they have the right to strike and engage in collective bargaining for their members of the union.
Right. And they also have a right to criticize the union or union leaders without retribution or retaliation too. And they have the right to engage in non-union activities.
And they can choose to do none of the union things. They can choose to basically just not be a part of any of it. So the act was set up to have all of these guarantees. It also means that employees are free from certain things. So that was a list of things they're free to do. A list of things they're free from is that they should be free from a threat for threats due to not participating in a union, meaning that they should not be threatened about their decision to not join a union if they chose not to. They should also, they are free from being questioned about their union participation by their employer, meaning that an employer cannot go, snooping around and investigating and asking employees if they are in or planning to join a union.
Right. They are also free from fines or restrictions or privileges due to choice of joining a union or not. So they cannot be fined or restricted or have privileges reduced because of their either engagement or non-engagement in that union.
Right.
And they are free from excessive surveillance by employers. So employers can't watch this person more because they are part of a union or because they're not part of a union. They can't change their procedures around how they observe their employees because of that.
Yeah, and part of this was that there was a fear, a correctly assumed fear, because this absolutely happens and has happened, is that if employers are concerned that a union is forming, they will put in all kinds of surveillance to try and detect and then prevent that union from forming. We'll talk a little bit more about that kind of thing later. But that was part of what this law was intended to do, was prevent employers from having excessive amounts of surveillance over their employees. And I'm sure that this is somewhat profession specific. So someone who is, for example, guarding a diamond vault, they probably have some kinds of provision where they can have a lot of surveillance of that employee because they're guarding an enormous amount of assets.
Right.
And so I'm sure that there are caveats or systems by which people can have high amounts of security when they need high amounts of security. It just means that they shouldn't. So I think what it is it justifiable levels of surveillance?
Right.
And I think that an employer just has to be able to make the case that it is. And in many cases it will be, right? But it just can't be excessive.
And one thing that this law does not do, this act that we're talking about, we talked about the employees' freedoms and their choices, what they're supposed to be free from, but none of the stuff that we're talking about has to do with ads.
All right, so we've been getting into this act so that we can clearly understand the history of the conditions that sort of led to the formation of unions, understand what the laws that were in place at the formation of these unions, but also what the laws don't do.
Right. So what the act did not do was prevent employment being dependent on an agreement to join a labor union. That's really, really important underneath this. So this means that workers could be compelled to join a union and thus pay union fees or else not be hired at that workplace, which sounds a little bit, a little bit coercive.
Yeah. And not that every union was going to do this, or in fact that many even did. I don't have those numbers exactly, just that they could do that. But that doesn't mean that they did do that very often, if at all, or how extensive it was.
Right.
But there was a concern that that would be a thing. And it seems like, at least in some instances, that did happen somewhere. But I don't think that was even the norm. Again, I don't have the numbers exactly. But an important thing is that was a concern.
Right.
Whether or not that was the effect, the concern was that the law enabled that. And so in 1947, there was a Taft-Hartley amendment that altered the language such that in states that passed such laws, employees could not be forced to join a union and thus pay union dues, is a very important part of that.
Right.
So they could not be forced to join a union and pay union dues as a condition of their employment. And so this 1947 Taft-Hartley amendment, it essentially made it that states could then put in right to work laws in their state. That amendment does not make it a national law. It gave states the rights to make their own laws about this.
Right. So of course it had to be one of my relatives that's causing this ruckus. I'm related to Taft somewhere very, very far down the line somehow. So
that's who it was. Couldn't remember who you said.
Yeah, it's that guy, the one that's buried in the National Cathedral in a giant tomb. Now, more than half of the U.S. states, 27, to be specific. So 27 states have passed right to work laws, and in the U.S. territory of Guam specifically, but most, not all, hence the word most, of these states are considered Southern. So that's also something to be mindful of too. Before we get into that, I think it is probably worth unpacking the arguments for and against right to work laws and kind of what people are saying in this discussion.
Should I read the list of the states that have joined, or just give a few?
I think we could probably give a few.
Yeah, I mean, so one that's not Southern is Nevada. Nevada has the right to work laws. Also South Dakota, although I think you certainly put them in the conservative belt.
Yeah.
But there's South Carolina, Texas, Utah, Utah's not Southern either, Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, also North Dakota, Michigan, Arkansas, Arizona, Alabama. So like there are a lot of southern states in there, but it follows the middle of the country for specific reasons.
Right. That's fair.
But as we said, we should unpack essentially what the arguments that people who are pro right to work are making. And again, this is why I want this to be a nuanced conversation and paint both sides really fairly, because I don't want to misrepresent their arguments at all. I want this to be as genuine as it can be.
Right. So most advocates of right to work laws argue that these laws do a few things. One, that they protect the worker's right to choose gainful employment, but to not participate in a union, to not pay union dues or fees. They also make the argument that these laws protect the worker's right to join a union without compulsion.
They also argue that these laws protect the worker's right to leave a union without any kind of threats to their overall employment. If they, for whatever reason, think that union does not represent them anymore or they don't want to participate.
They also state that these laws reduce the tax and spend policies that happen in Washington.
All right. We'll have to unpack that one a little bit later, I'm thinking. But that's essentially a case that they explicitly made, was that the right to work states essentially quell the problem of tax and spend policies. Let's just leave it at that for now.
Absolutely.
Again, we're talking about the pros here. We're talking about the people arguing for right to work laws. So there's several studies where people are have argued about what are all the important and reasonable metrics that we could look at to see whether right to work states have a positive impact. And there's many ways you could slice that, right? There's a lot of ways that you could look at the data. There's lots of different data to look at. There are many choices you make to try and make that. One of them is that they argue that the people who are against right to work laws say, well, this weakens unions, so there will be fewer unions.
Right.
Well, in one study in Oklahoma, they point to the fact that data show that union membership didn't change after the state enacted right to work laws. So they didn't have the right to work laws, then they did. Membership stayed about the same. And this indicates that people were able to choose to maintain memberships in their unions, and they decided to do so. And the state is sort of saying, yeah, fine. Like, we just wanted you to have the choice. And now you do, and you chose to keep doing that thing. That's fine. That's up to you.
Right.
And so that's kind of the argument that they're making here, is saying that, like, it's not necessarily the case that labor union participation will decrease. And so they're like, we're just getting our point across that what we want to support is workers' rights.
Sure. Other right-to-work advocates have also pointed to the idea that if companies are not spending as much money because a union isn't forcing them to, then they can and will pay employees a higher salary. So, said another way, if companies are able to save money on what they would describe as unnecessary union grievances, then that money that would be spent on those concerns would be going back to the employees for higher salaries for their work.
And this one's more in the camp of hypotheticals, because the other one I said was a study. This is not a study.
Yeah.
This is them instead saying that, like, you don't need a union. Not only will you make less money because we can't afford to pay you, but it'll cost you more money, right? And so they're sort of saying, like, people will end up making more money under right to work policies. It also means that if companies don't have to spend more money on employees in these right to work states, presumably because they're dealing with unions, essentially, that they'll be able to hire more people, which means that there's generally more employment to go around. Like, that's a logical sort of conclusion that they're reaching.
Right. And then finally, if employees aren't having their wages garnished by paying union fees, that means they have more after-tax income that they can spend on things that increase their standards of living. So therefore, people in right-to-work states enjoy a higher standard of living. Again, that's one of the arguments here.
We're not espousing our opinions yet. We're just trying to say what they're arguing for here.
Right.
I think it is probably, I was going to wait until a little bit later to talk about the tax and spend policies, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it here because I think it's worth just understanding that part of it. And essentially what they were arguing with the tax and spend policies, and what they explicitly say on their website, is that states that don't have right to work are more likely to elect politicians who vote on large spending bills. That's essentially what they're saying. Said another way, states that are more likely to elect a Democratic representative are also states who are not likely to have right to work laws. And therefore, the states that have more unions are more likely to send more Democrats to positions of power in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. And they don't like that because that obviously means that there are not as many people who are sort of on the conservative spectrum of things. So I think they loosely consider that it means overrepresentation of like unions in these places, I think, is maybe their concern. Again,
Sure.
I'm trying to be as charitable as I can in addressing their arguments.
I think you said that well.
Okay. That's essentially the pros, the things that they're talking about with why people are for right to work policies. So let's go ahead and dig into those counter arguments, the people who are against right to work policies.
So most opponents of right to work laws argue that these laws do a few things. One, that they hamstring a union's bargaining power to advocate pay and benefits for employees. Another is that they decrease participation in unions. And another is that they lower employee income or at least prevent raises in income as part of these laws.
Opponents of the right to work laws also say that what these laws really do is benefit corporations more than they benefit workers by essentially making it a more hospitable place for the top sort of 1% of organizations than for the people who are doing most of the work sort of down below. And the other, I think one of their biggest points in the whole criticism of right to work laws is that they enable free riders, because what the right to work laws do that is not really stated in the sort of right to work thesis is that although people cannot be compelled to join a union, they do maintain access to the benefits of a union. So if they go to join a place of work, that if they choose not to join the union is still, by these laws, obligated to bargain on this employee's behalf. When they engage in collective bargaining that raises all people's wages, the non-union members get to benefit as well, even though they are not participating in that union. Mm-hmm. It means that they get to reap the benefits of other protections and benefits that are gained for union members, although, again, they're not participating in the union. And so they call them these free riders, and that's that they basically get all these benefits without having to pay union dues, without being obligated to be of service to the union, and that they're sort of saying that's not really fair to the people who are then shouldering that burden.
Right. They also argue that these right to work laws are necessary because the 1935 NLRA actually made it illegal to force someone to join a union as a condition of their employment. So everything beyond that law, they are arguing is, or that act specifically, is kind of like gilding the lily. It's like, it's extra unnecessary. It's unga pachka, I think is what they say, right? It's like too much.
Well, and essentially they're saying, I think that
it's a redundancy.
It's a redundancy, yeah, and it's like it's not actually doing what they're saying that what their thesis here is that it undermines the primary tenet of the right to work laws, because the right to work laws say that people need to have the choice to be able to not join union if they don't want to, and still be able to work at that job and not have their privilege, that they don't get fewer work hours because they're not in the union. Like they don't have lower wages because of the union, that sort of thing. That's essentially what they're saying. And they're sort of saying, well, that's already the case, so that's why it's unnecessary. They also express concern that one of the things that unions will do is they will specifically advocate and bargain for higher safety standards and like work conditions or working conditions generally. Right. And so that what happens then is that places that do not have unions have weaker unions or have some, smaller membership in their unions, whatever's going on there. If these right to work laws affect unions from being able to do what they do, then employers will generally adopt lower safety standards, meaning that you're going to have more people who are injured in the workplace, who have adverse health issues because of their job, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're sort of making the case that rights to work laws make it harder for people to have safe working conditions.
Sure. We're going to talk more about like some examples of this, but I could see some examples of that happening, right? Where it's like, if you don't have somebody holding you accountable, then you're not going to do the thing that is required of you.
Yeah. There was supposed to be sort of a bulleted summary list of sort of reasons or arguments, but I think there's more to expand upon. And wouldn't you like to know what that is? But first you have to listen to ads. Our union says we can come back from the ads.
Yay!
let's further elaborate on some of the claims here for the opponents of right to work laws.
So many critics point to the fact that there are many studies and analyses that have shown that no matter how you look at the data, employees in states with right to work laws make less money than states without right to work laws. That is to say, wages are higher in states without right to work laws in every possible way to aggregate and average the data. So their argument is that no matter how you spin it, no matter how you analyze it, no matter how you massage it, right to work states have a lower wage for employees than non-right to work states.
Yes. And so one of the arguments that was made in favor of right to work states is that, like, well, employers will be able to pay their employees more. And the critics point out, like, well, but that's not what's happening.
Right.
Here are the data. Every piece of data from every place that we've ever gathered, it shows conclusively, definitively, and at 100% of the time that in right to work states, wages are lower.
Right.
So what I wanted to do is really try and break down the components here into what is the essential argument, what is the essential thesis, if you will, of the anti-right to work discussion here. And essentially, these advocates against right to work, they argue that these laws mean people are less likely to join a union, that there will be fewer, smaller, and or weaker unions, and that this will benefit the companies who are more likely to hire more people, but at a lower wage. Okay, so that's part of it.
Sure.
They also point out that it is already federally protected to be able to choose whether or not to join a union without compulsion, and that employees do not have to pay dues for political causes. And therefore, these right to work laws are pointless, right? Because they're essentially saying that the laws already protect the rights that are the main argument that right to work people are sort of making.
Right.
In right to work states, it seems that the only difference between a right to work state and a non-right to work state is that unions are forced to represent and benefit employees in right to work states, but that employees do not have to meaningfully contribute to the union. They still get those benefits, which means that this stretches the union's budget just paper thin, and it forces the due-paying members of the union to shoulder the financial and legal burden of all employees, which they often cannot do. Thus, the responsibility of the many ends up being carried out by the few, sometimes to the breaking point and shutting down that union altogether.
Right. To be clear, I think there's still a lot to unpack within that, right? To be clear, what this is saying is essentially that because these right to work states have it set up, or they basically have it set up so that there are people that will gain the benefits of the union without being in the union. The union in itself it already has finite resources, and it has finite resources because of the fee paying members of the union, the due paying members, right?
Yeah.
So for every one person that's in the union, there are, let's say, 3, 4, 5 people that are choosing not to be in the union, which is fine, choose that. But that one person is shouldering the burden of making sure that those other 4 or 5 people reap the benefits of the union. Those people that are not paying dues are still gaining from not being in the union.
Right. And I think that then the what would happen in non-right to work states is that people could choose not to join the union, and then they just wouldn't get the benefits of the union.
Right.
They just don't get all the sort of perks that come with being a due paying member. And so that's it. I had a really hard time really drawing a clear line there, but that was most consistently what I could find on both sides of the discussion, pro or against, that the main difference in right to work is that people can benefit from the union without contributing to the union.
Right. So it may go without saying, but right to work laws are particularly favored by conservative politicians. But what's interesting about that is that conservative politicians tend to express a lot of anger and resentment toward policies that provide non-contingent support for people in principle because it means spending tax money on people who don't, quote unquote, deserve it. That is, the responsibility of many is carried by the few, like we just talked about. In that context, if the principal value is earned wages and proportionate wages for those who work harder, you would think that the specific protection of the right to work folks to force the organization to pay people who aren't contributing would be antithetical to conservatives. So their preference for right to work laws show that it is not the fact that it isn't fair for some people to receive benefits when they don't earn them. Instead, their value is whatever best protects the assets of the people who already have the most.
Makes sense. I mean, just like trying to say here that, like, a lot of times there's a couple of steps. Like, it tends to be conservatives who favor right to work laws, which is why you tend to see the most conservative states have right to work laws generally, or the most libertarian states will have those. And what's interesting about it is that what these laws seem to do is enable freeloaders. Like, that seems to be what they're specifically designed to do, is to enable freeloaders, right?
Right.
But what's antithetical about that is often the argument against welfare spending, against low-income housing, against government for debt forgiveness, all the things that the government does that sort of supports people. They're sort of saying we can't spend tax dollars to support these people, and they don't even deserve it, is what they're deserve being a very loaded word. But I think that that's essentially what is being implied, is like, they're not working, they shouldn't get unemployment. They're, the fact that these things happen to them, bummer, bad things happen, but like, that doesn't mean the rest of us should have to pay for it. That's sort of the thing, that there's no freeloaders. And yet this exact policy, again, seems to be tailor-made to promote freeloading so that it will gut the power of the union. And if that's the case, then it says that their value actually isn't that they don't like freeloading. It is that what they like is that the people who have the most power get to keep the most power, because that's what those two different approaches will do, right? The one that says that people shouldn't get support when they're down is so that you can protect people who would be spending the money that have the resources to support those people.
Right.
And when that's not the case, then we don't want people to necessarily earn their money, because if they don't get set up so that they're paid more, that means the people who are at the top get to keep more of their money. So again, it's just protecting power for the sake of protecting power.
Right. And again, this is part of the arguments against right to work that people make, right? I mean, that is one of the talking points, is that exact thing, is that if everybody benefits, then isn't that part of kind of like what they would describe in other places as handouts?
Right. Exactly.
That's what they're kind of saying here. Now, states without right to work laws, and this is under the cons of right to work laws. States without right to work laws have an umbrella effect where not only do the employees who work for the company that have unions, do they see higher wages, so do the employees who work for non-union companies. And so higher union participation states have benefits that extend to everyone, from safer work conditions to better benefits to higher salary and everything in between. So essentially what they're saying is, in those places where most people are part of a union and the unions do have strength, the strength in the union also kind of bleeds out into other places where unions aren't present or people are not participatory in unions.
Okay, there's another important piece of the discussion of rights to work that I think many people will see coming and many people maybe won't. But when you talk about why people do what they do, there is an unfortunate amount of racism and bigotry that creeps into like almost every conversation about anything, right?
Yeah, especially in the U.S.
Especially in the United States, where it's practically a sport in some states.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the right to work laws, no different here. Important to discuss the sort of racist element in it. Now, it goes back to this Vance Muse guy that we were talking about before. Ooh. And this guy, I mean, and he was very sort of flamboyant in his, not flamboyant in the sense that I think people would maybe associate with LGBT people, but flamboyant in the sense that he was very self-aggrandizing all the time.
Sure.
He was really proud of himself, called himself the best lobbyist in the country, etc. He formed all kinds of gigantic mega donor special interest groups that he started. And as we said, he specifically said, I am for white supremacy. Now, he took this further. So in 1944, they were campaigning to pass right to work legislation in Arkansas, which did go through. Before this, he had fronted this Christian American Association, which was a front for wealthy special interest groups. It was basically just wealthy people who were sort of these special interest groups that were flying under the banner of Christianity to have public support, right? And they distributed all this literature to try and make their case for right to work, arguing that if their efforts did not go through, that, quote, white women and white men will be forced into organizations, labor unions, with black African apes whom they will have to call brother or lose their jobs, end quote. So real piece of shit, this guy.
It's not really a surprise. I mean, when this was all going on, he was sending labor organizers to the South to kind of stir the flames and like stir up people. Like he was sending them people, like sending them down there to specifically like to flyer or pamphlet the town with all this information that was just like completely unfounded. And it ended up that some of the first right to work laws were enacted in 1944, around that time, 44 after the Taft-Hartley amendment. And so Arkansas and Florida were the first to adopt them.
Yeah.
Not surprised. But, even like Martin Luther King actually had some stuff to say about this. So there's a really great quote here. In our glorious fight for civil rights, we must guard against being fooled by false slogans such as right to work. It is a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions and the freedom of collective bargaining by which unions have improved wages and working conditions for everyone. Wherever these laws have been passed, wages are lower, job opportunities are fewer, and there are no civil rights. End quote. That was from Martin Luther King in 1964 about this specific topic.
Wow. I found this really interesting interactive map that also shows the adoption of right to work laws in the United States. I'm going to illustrate that in a second, but just to finish up really quick on this Muse guy, it will not come as a surprise to most people, given that we've described that he is a white supremacist. He is also anti-Semitic, I should say. He's not around anymore. He fronted all these wealthy special interest groups to hide money and that sort of thing. He, of course, opposed women's suffrage. He worked to repeal child labor laws and the 8-hour day for railroaders. So basically making it so that they could be forced to work longer hours. He was active in the Committee for the Americanization of the Supreme Court, which was really just targeting a Jewish man named Justice Felix Frankfurter. He was a very active dude whose primary activities were to ruin as many people as he possibly could, particularly if they were not white men.
Right. Yeah, this guy was not going into this with any good intentions, it seems.
No. And so another part of this, because I think it's worth talking about, that the majority of places where unions exist, they're often blue-collar jobs. Not always, but often blue-collar jobs, which are people who generally make lower wages, who do not have a lot of education, who are doing a lot of like manufacturing and industrial work and things that require a lot of physicality to them a lot of the time.
Right.
They can also entail some amount of exposure to dangerous chemicals, depending on the job. There's lots of these types of jobs. And the people, if you tend to look at economic distribution, it tends to be the case that it is harder for people who are not white to see upward mobility, meaning that they gain more income, which means that the people who are not white tend to be more highly represented in blue collar work. And if you are weakening unions, then you are specifically weakening organizations where they have a large proportion of representation of people who are not white, because those are where those people tend to end up economically due to the system.
Right. Basically, what we're saying is that this is just another example, it appears, of systemic racism at play that is actively and effectively harming large swaths of minority demographics. I mean, that's just ultimately what's happening here.
Right. So just a real quick summary of this interesting trend. So this was kicked off in the 1940s, as we said. 1947 was when that amendment passed. Immediately, these laws started going into place. In the 1940s, you had 11 states kick off the right to work laws. It's like basically as soon as that amendment went into place, 11 states jumped on the bandwagon. After that, in the 1950s, you got about 6 more. In the 1960s, you got 1 more. In the 1970s, you got 1 more. So they really slowed down. In the 1980s, you get 1 more. They have 11 to kick off, 6 more, and then just 1 at a time for a few decades, 1 per decade, basically.
Sure.
In the 1990s, there were none. There were no states who adopted right to work legislation. In 2000s, there was 1 more. And then after 2010, 5 more states all of a sudden jumped on the bandwagon. After this trajectory of there having been, only 11 to begin with, then 6, then 1, then 1, then 1, then 0, and then 1, and then all of a sudden 5. It was like, what's going on? All of a sudden that there's this huge increase in all of these states.
Right.
And a lot of these, interestingly, are states that historically had a lot of really strong labor unions. Michigan being chief among them as one of the leaders of states that had a lot going for it in terms of sort of protecting employees and people who had some of the highest standards of living because of all the car manufacturing plants that were there. and that paid people really well. And then all of a sudden in the 2010s, there's this big flip.
It's super interesting to watch. Like this is, I think why political science is so fascinating when you really get into it, is like these little events that have these like ripple effects that change everything, and kind of these ebbs and flows of social movements and what we find important, and how, as somebody who's interested in political science, how upsetting it is that most of these things don't ever follow actual data.
Right. There is some amount of values that are embedded in like how you interpret these data. And I think that that's important, because sort of saying like, well, here's the outcome in states that have right to work laws that versus don't, among those sort of measurements we were talking about earlier, where you want to say, is this a good idea or not?
Right.
And whether or not it's good depends on sort of where you're coming from. So we can just dig into those exact data. So because most of this time, we've really just been talking about what other people have said, whether they're for or against, what our arguments have been. And we haven't really necessarily weighed in with our opinion explicitly, though it certainly has colored a bit of it.
Sure.
But there are actual data. Unfortunately, there are also actual ads. All right, we've been talking about, well, racism recently, but as per usual, at some point it comes up. There's all the arguments that people were making. What do the data actually say?
These data that we're going to talk about come from multiple sources, so it is worth kind of unpacking that. But right to work states do tend to have a higher rate of employment across the state. So you are going to see higher rates of employment across that state that does have those right to work laws. Also, right to work states typically have lower union participation. So you have higher rates of employment, lower rates of union engagement.
And they were sort of saying the right to work is not pro or anti-union. That's what the pro right to work things say. And there was the one study that showed that in Oklahoma, at least, there was not a marked decrease in union participation after right to work laws went into place. But everywhere else there has been. Pretty much that is the exception, not the rule. The rule is that union participation decreases in right to work states, which seems to have been largely the goal of the right to work. But sorry, that's not the data part.
Right.
That was just interpretation. Here's the data part. Right to work states do have lower wages than average, and non-right to work states do have higher wages than average. Of course, that is kind of inevitable when they both contribute to the average, like they're going to pull apart once you look at those data streams. But that means that, as we said earlier, every single place where non-right to work states have policies, they have higher wages. And in every single place where they have right to work policies, they have lower wages, which approximately a $3 per hour difference in states with right to work laws.
I mean, that's a huge difference, I think.
I mean, and that's the average. Like, it can obviously be much more disparate than that, but I'd be willing to bet that because you have minimum wage, that's artificially preventing the bottom from going down as low as it probably could,
right,
if you didn't have a federally guaranteed minimum wage.
Right, absolutely. Another point that comes up is that right to work states do tend to have more jobs in the private sector than states that do not have right to work laws. So there are a higher number of private sector jobs in these right to work states.
And right to work states do tend to see corporations more lucrative, I guess. They do better financially, economically. The larger corporations do better in those types of states. So again, there's some values here. Is it a good thing that those corporations do better? Is it a good thing that there are more jobs in the private sector? Like, those are going to depend on the values that you have going into it. But I think we can still share sort of our opinions about this.
I have absolutely no problem sharing my opinion on this.
Okay.
I think that ultimately what I'm hearing in all of this discussion and some of the pro right to work arguments were that, oh, if companies don't have to pay for union stuff or be forced to spend money, then it'll go back to the employees. But that's just Reaganomics, right? That's trickle down where it's not happening.
Yeah, exactly.
So what we're seeing is those companies that are more financially, profitable are also in those states that have lowest wages. So there is a discussion, I think, around that piece where, the right to a living wage and the employee in general, I think, should take kind of the forefront of the conversation. That person's wages, that person's safety, that person's benefits, all of those things. And typically those are managed and handled and bargained for within the union space. So I tend to land on, overall, as a general rule, unions tend to be the good thing, and right to work states tend to discourage people away from unions. And that ultimately maybe not explicitly, but there is kind of an insidious kind of harm that happens long term, ultimately, I think.
And disproportionately affecting people who like need that support the most.
Absolutely.
Where I want to come in at this, as I said, is I want to be nuanced. And I think communicating that my bias is generally pro-union because unions tend to protect people, both their wages, their safety, kind of a lot of their benefits. A lot of ways are that unions, the reason they come to exist is to give people a way to advocate for themselves.
Right.
And that results in them getting a lot of benefits that they wouldn't have otherwise had. So there are lots of really important critical discussions to get into unions, and where unions do things that I think are against anyone's values. And I think that we should unpack unions by themselves at some other point. But I think in general, the point being that unions are good. That's where my bias comes in.
Right.
But I think it's also difficult to say that someone should be forced to join a union as a condition of their employment. Like, I do understand that being a concern. I can imagine if I worked somewhere where the union engaged in and represented activities and political orientations that were the opposite of mine, I wouldn't want to be forced to join that union, even if I really, really wanted that job. And I would say I should have the right to not be forced to join that union. I do understand that point. I think that's a really important consideration there.
But I think in that point, too, I think it's fair to understand that that person, whoever that person is that opts out of the union, opts out of having a representative come to the table and bargain for them.
Right.
Opt out of like those types of things. And I think that's the thing that I keep going back to, too, is like if you don't want to be in a union, you shouldn't be forced to be in a union, but you also shouldn't get all of the like the rest of the union. I mean, I'm also very much so like a chaotic kind of person when it comes to stuff. I'm like, everybody should benefit no matter what. And I think that unions shouldn't, it shouldn't be this like complex an argument. And it would be a less complex argument if the wealth was shared down like people keep talking about it happening, but it's not happening like that. So I just keep landing on, no matter what your opinion is on unions or not, I think that we need to tax the rich more.
I've been thinking about doing an episode on that too. I think it'd be a really good mini. Yeah. Because there's, I was hearing something about, there was a point in history in some European country where the rich were being taxed at like 90%. Which, I mean, people are going to hear that and like want to break something. But what was interesting about it is they had so much money that them being taxed at 90% meant that they still had more money than almost everyone else put together. Right. Like, that's how unequally the wealth sort of existed and where it was distributed. Anyway, I think it's a really interesting conversation to have inside of that. You're absolutely right, I think, is that where my point on this would come down is that, like, if you don't want to join a union, fine. That just means you don't get to participate in the benefits of the union. There are some that you're going to get either way. Like, if they've put in safety precautions that make that so that, like, as part of that company's policy, they have to have these safety measures in place. Even if you're not in the union, you'll benefit from that.
That's a good thing for everybody.
Exactly. Everybody wins in that situation. So, like, you shouldn't get union representation if you have some grievance against your employer because you chose not to have that representation by saying you didn't want to be part of the union. And that's fine. Like, you got it. Those are the choices you are faced with, right? Like, you just don't get to have your cake and eat it too. And the way that super bizarre saying works is like, if you can not both not participate and then also get all the benefits from it, you'll still get some inadvertently. Like, you have to, but like the special ones that are more active that you're not contributing to, I would just say, like, then you're just opting out of it, and that's fine.
Well, and I think the other side too is like, I can hear the argument just from an accessibility standpoint where people will say, well, the union dues are so much, I can't afford union dues as part of my job. I'm forced to opt out of union benefits and stuff. And I think that that's a conversation to be had too, as far as accessibility and making union dues, affordable for people and making it easier to be in a union so that they can still, there's a lot to unpack there that comes from like the social justice standpoint. Sure. And again, I don't know enough of the intricacies of that piece. I just know that whenever there's a discussion around, I have to pay money to get into a club, that's always a discussion of accessibility and living wages and stuff like that. So, yeah,
and you also don't know like what someone's circumstances like. They have a lot of debt, they have a lot of kids, they have a lot of medical bills, whatever that might be. that like what their income means to them is going to be different than it means to someone who doesn't have all those things.
Right.
Not that I'm saying any company should be obligated to account for those explicitly, but just thinking about like what comes from participating in a union in a way that supports or doesn't support these employees, and they're just going to have different situations. So like factoring those into the conversation at least.
Right. Exactly.
Now, I also think with all of the things that I've said and that we've said is that like it already seems that people can't be forced to join a union. So there's relatively little issue like on that part of things.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think I do understand, I think what the right to work legislation is trying to say, but how it's been, the way that it was set up right from the outset was problematic. You know, this began as a way to like, they were not shy about the fact that this was intended to try and weaken unions, right? They were specifically citing the fact that they wanted this legislation so that people wouldn't have to have mixed race groups inside of an employee. Like, that's a problem. So it just seems like the right to work legislation. So one of the things I think is important to say, that was a weird stream of consciousness, several transitions. But where I want to go with this is that both sides are a little disingenuous. Okay. And where I think the critics, the opponents of right to work are disingenuous is they're saying they're trying to undermine the thesis that people should not be compelled to join a union by saying people already aren't compelled to join a union. Like they can't be. But I think where they're being disingenuous is I think that's because of the Taft-Hartley Act, which is the one that enabled right to work to exist, right?
Right.
And so I think that they're sort of trying to pretend that that's, or just, obfuscate the fact that that's the reason that people are protected, while saying that like now we don't need these right to work laws because of that act or that amendment, and the amendment is the reason right to work laws happen. So that's where they're being disingenuous.
Sure. I think it's fair.
And where I think the pro right to work people are being just disingenuous is kind of on the same side as theirs is on the flip side of that coin, which is they're sitting here arguing, we think that we need to pass right to work laws so that people can elect to not participate in a union if they don't want to without any repercussions on their employment. And I'm like, yeah, that was covered in the Taft-Hartley Amendment,
right?
And if not already from the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. So like, essentially you're sort of saying we need to have these laws to protect this while citing the law that protects it already.
Right.
So anyway, I think that's where they're both sort of being a little disingenuous with their arguments. This is not to say that they're wrong, just to say that like they're not sort of speaking the whole part of it.
They're not using clarity or it's one of those things where it's like both sides are arguing an agenda. I mean, truly, when it comes to that.
Very much so. Yeah, and that's clear. And so, like I said, I think in general, we're going to be in favor of things that are pro-union, because I think we are pro-union, and things that weaken unions then are not in line with things we're generally going to be in support of.
Sure.
And no matter how you choose to spin it, it seems like that the right to work legislation means less wages and weaker unions. And so that's why I think it's something that it doesn't make as much sense from someone who has the values that we have.
100%. I agree with you there.
One really quick thing. This was just something that I found in talking about this, because there's this union in some of the original, the National Labor Relations Act. It specifically says in this act that an employer cannot engage in union busting activities. It can't like post propaganda, force people to attend seminars, like threaten people.
Right.
Yeah. It can't actually like fire people over their decision or the consideration of joining a union. So those things are illegal, and they 100% happen. Like flagrantly happen a lot in this country. So like, it's also like that side is also not playing fair, like they're already breaking the actual law and then trying to like advocate for laws to make it easier for them to break the law, basically.
Right. Well, and a lot of times right to work laws will have embedded in them some type of way that allows there's some language around union busting techniques that make them quote unquote not union busting, when the truth is like they like employers can go, well, I'm just providing information.
Right.
And it's like, but you're doing it under the guise of like, you have to be at this meeting. Like, I'm going to present this information at this meeting that was not optional. you can do with this information what you will. But like they've made it so that like those right to work, it's almost like pork belly legislation where it's like kind of like rolled into right to work stuff where they have legalized state specific union busting techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's generally a lot more to say about this topic. We just wanted to get into, and where I think this aligns with anything, I know we didn't get super into the sort of psychological weeds of things. I think it's what I wanted to point to is sort of where the agendas were. Like, what are the motives here? The people who have right to work legislation, again, the motives are to protect companies. That's primarily it. And the one thing I was thinking also is a lot of them say, like, in these right to work states, companies do tend to do better. And they were also making the case like, well, because they're not dealing with unions, the companies have more money. What that means is, by not dealing with unions, is because companies aren't paying their employees as much and they're not investing in safety and workplace condition upgrades or like higher standards
or benefits.
Yeah, then the company has more money, and like that's why they can hire more people cheaper. It's because they're paying more people less money, so they're getting more work for less money. That, of course, is going to be in their best interest. So, it's just these disingenuous, bad faith arguments where they're sort of they're trying to sell you one thing while doing it something different, and it's just not fair is the way to put it, but it doesn't quite capture it. It's like up. you know?
Well, because it's not providing all of the information or being honest about the information that's out there. Like, or I mean, even in the best scenario, the people that believe that companies will trickle down their money, like they truly believe that, but they have ignored every economics class or just ignore humans who have resources, right? Like at the end of the day, I think that's a really important thing is like, on paper, they're like, well, yeah, companies can spend more money on this. And then the reality is that CEOs and higher leadership are reporting record profits for companies that have some of the worst working conditions. And you go, well, why is that money not going back into the labor force or the workforce? And it's not, because people don't do that. And so I think for that to be a talking point in the pro right to work discussion is so interesting that it stayed, given that we know that it doesn't happen.
Right. I think there's generally a lot more to say about, like I said, this. We sort of briefly touched on this topic, and I'm hoping at least that we did some amount of justice to unpacking the nuances of the conversation. And again, being really transparent about the fact that because we're relatively pro-union, our values are not going to reflect the values of something that is not also pro-union.
Sure.
I do also understand the problems with unions. And again, we do need to tackle those because they are not ubiquitously good.
Right.
Part of the impetus of this conversation is because there were so recently so many new states adopting right to work legislation. We're in an election year. And so the conversations around this are happening a little bit more than they have been recently. And also because we're coming out of a year of like a record-setting amount of major strikes that happened because of labor unions who organized to engage in collective bargaining. And when that didn't work out, then people stopped working. So there's a whole aspect of this that we're like, this happened in the public view in a really big way just in 2023. Right. And so I think the idea of labor unions and legislation around right to work and all kinds of things that was kind of at the surface and at the top, and worth pointing out that it was kind of a unique time that we find ourselves. And when we talk about unions, it'll be worth also diving into the fact that part of the reason this happened is because during the pandemic, a lot of unions did relinquish some of their bargaining power, given that it was a different circumstance. And so there's something to talk about inside of that as well. And that seems to have been part of the fuel that kicked off, that ignited these protests and strikes that happened.
Right. Absolutely.
We've talked so long. This is one of our longer ones when I definitely thought it was going to be one of our shorter ones, but that's why I didn't say it was going to be shorter, because I thought I'd jinx it, but it didn't help.
You know, it's a skill. It's a superpower.
So we should probably cap it here then, yeah?
I think now's a good time.
All right, perfect. So hopefully we did as much justice as we can. If you'd like to reach out to us and tell us what we got wrong, what we got right, etc., we like hearing from you. You can also reach us on the social media platforms. And speaking of which, if you'd like to support us, you should go over there and tag us, leave a rating and review, subscribe, share us with a friend. You can go to our website to pick up some merch if you'd like to do that. If you join us on Patreon, you get all kinds of bonus goodies and things that are delicious. That includes a super group of people who are fantastic, who are so generous, and we really appreciate them, which is Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you all so much for your continued support of our show.
So much love your way.
Also, thank you to my team without whom I could not do this podcast. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Anytime.
Our writers and fact checkers are Shane and myself. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Our audio production, amazing, magical, make a sound good guy is Justin. And then, of course, thank you all my listeners. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's so great. It's so without you, we would not be.
Yes.
Sine qua non, right? Without which it could not be.
Semper Fi. I don't know what that means.
No, that's a different thing.
Okay. Anyway, we actually aren't completely done yet because whether or not you're joining us for the first time or you've been with us for a while, we have a little tradition here that we plug at the end of our episodes where we like to recommend something that we found joyful recently or just that was at the forefront of our mind. So let's get to some recommendations.
Let's do that. Recommendations.
Okay, I am recommending a book. I actually don't remember if I've recommended this book recently. Have I recommended this yet, Shane?
We talked about this book, but I don't think that you recommended this book recently.
Okay. All right. I actually finished reading this book in December. It was after we recorded our year wrap-up episode, so it wasn't on that list, but I've been thinking about it ever since, and I kind of just want to read it all over again because I liked it so much.
That's great.
It was that good. And this is a book called Project Hail Mary.
Okay.
This is by author Andy Weir that people will most likely know from The Martian.
Uh-huh.
He wrote the book that turned into the movie. He wrote another book called Artemis, which was also
great.
a lot of fun. Yeah, and he tends to do what I would call hard sci-fi. So he takes a fictional scenario that hasn't happened, and he has the main characters, navigate that scenario using a lot of science.
Right.
Like existing known science. But there are, of course, major fictional elements that are built in, like
moon bases
or someone who is stranded on Mars, who has never, like humans have never been to Mars. So there's, is an element of that sort of thing.
Sure.
But I don't want to give very much away on this book. Like even setting up the premise, it kind of caught me off guard because I didn't know anything going in. And so I kind of like that for other people. I will say that if you've read Andy Weir's other stuff, the problem solving element is the same. So like, major scientific thing happens, smart person needs to use science to alleviate that issue.
Sure.
As being sort of the general description of it. That's all stays about the same. This one took a very different turn than I was expecting it to. Again, not knowing anything going into it. And I think is maybe his best book. And The Martian was maybe my favorite book before this. So I'm very torn between the two, but this one was so good. Or at least I loved it. So if you're into hard sci-fi, you could do a lot worse than Project Hail Mary by author Andy Weir.
Yeah, he definitely takes a page out of the Asimov storytelling where it's like very hard sci-fi and stuff like that. Like, so if you're like, it's not like Philip K. Dick has a little bit of it, but it's more fantastical. So like, if you like hard sci-fi, like Asimov stuff, like you'll dig it. I mean, I've read both The Martian and Artemis, and they're both incredible.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to read this one.
Cool. That's my recommendation.
I love it. My recommendation is a video game. So yesterday I took my son to GameStop. He got a gift card for his birthday and he picked out this video game that was Ghostbusters, the video game remastered. I remember I've loved Ghostbusters my entire life. Like I can't think of a time where I haven't. I think that's like applying science to supernatural phenomenon. I think is always really fascinating. Yeah. So they put out this game a few years ago and they remastered it. And this game is you are a Ghostbuster who has joined the Ghostbusting team with the original cast. So the original cast produced it, wrote it, and they voiced everybody in it.
Okay.
And you are a Ghostbuster in New York, like doing Ghostbuster things. You're trapping ghosts. You're firing the proton pack. It's so much fun.
Wow.
And it's like the best Ghostbusters game experience that you could possibly have. Like you get to be a Ghostbuster. You get to use the equipment. You get to bust ghosts. Like how could you not? How could you want more?
And what platform is this on?
It's across multiple platforms. We have it on the Switch.
Okay, got you.
So
awesome. Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. I think I would. I tend to also really like Ghostbuster content, and the idea of running around being a Ghostbuster in New York just fills me with joy. Just the idea of it just fills me with joy.
Yeah, it's so fun.
That's really lovely.
It's so good.
Awesome. As I said, if you'd like to talk to us about the right to work legislation or unions, if you would like to talk to us about some books or video games that you've played recently that you really like, or if you've read Project Hail Mary or played the Ghostbusters video game and want to weigh in, we love hearing from everybody. Email us directly, info@wwdpodcast.com, or reach out to us on the other social media platforms. Shane, is there anything I am forgetting or that you would like to add before we wrap up today?
Nothing else here.
All right, then that is it. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.